The wind came first. It always did in Wyoming, carrying with it the scent of sagebrush and distant storms that never seemed to arrive. Sheriff Thomas Wardell had learned to read that wind the way some men read scripture, searching for meaning in the invisible currents that shaped the high desert. On the morning of September 14th, 1894, the wind carried something different, something that tasted like copper and ash, something that made the horses in the stable stamp their hooves and roll their eyes white with fear. Thomas stood on the porch of the sheriff's office in Redemption Creek, a town that existed more as an agreement between desperate men than as any real settlement. 300 souls, maybe less, depending on whether you counted the drifters who came through, looking for work in the silver mines that had long since played out. The buildings leaned into each other like old men sharing secrets, their wood bleached gray by sun and wind, and the weight of years that passed too slowly in places where hope had packed up and moved on. He was 42 years old that morning, though the lines around his eyes and the silver threading through his dark hair suggested a harder accounting. 20 years wearing a badge in territories where law was something you enforced with your fists first and your words second, if at all. He had killed 7 men in the line of duty. He remembered each one, their names, their faces, the sound their bodies made when they hit the dust. The first had been in Kansas, 1876, a bank robber named Calvin Reese, who had drawn on him outside a saloon in Dodge City. Thomas had been 24 then, newly deputized, his hands still smooth, and his conscience still clean. The bullet had caught Calvin in the chest, and he had lived for 3 minutes afterward, long enough to curse Thomas with his dying breath, long enough for Thomas to understand that killing a man was nothing like he had imagined. It was not clean or heroic. It was wet and ugly and final. The second had been a rustler, the third a claim jumper, the fourth a man whose name he never learned, who had tried to kill him for no reason Thomas could ever discern. The fifth and sixth had come together, brothers who had robbed a stagecoach and killed the driver. Thomas had tracked them for 2 weeks across Colorado, finally cornering them in a box canyon where they had chosen to fight rather than surrender. The seventh had been just last year, right here in Redemption Creek, a drifter who had beaten a prostitute nearly to death and then pulled a knife when Thomas tried to arrest him. 7 men, 7 lives ended by his hand. 7 faces that visited him in dreams and whispered accusations he could never fully answer. He had done his duty. He had enforced the law, but the law demanded blood, and blood left stains that no amount of righteousness could wash away. These were the kind of memories that settled into a man's bones and stayed there, aching on cold mornings and whispering in the spaces between sleep and waking. The town was quiet, too quiet, even for a Thursday morning when most folks were either sleeping off Wednesday night's whiskey or already down in what remained of the mines, chipping away at rock that refused to give up its secrets. Samuel Hutchins should have been opening the general store by now, his cough echoing across the street as he swept the porch. Mary Chen should have been hanging laundry behind the boarding house, the white sheets snapping in the wind like surrender flags. But the street was empty except for dust devils that rose and fell and rose again, dancing to music only they could hear. Thomas descended the 3 steps from the porch, his boots connecting with the hard-packed earth, with a sound that seemed too loud in the stillness. He had not slept well. Dreams had plagued him through the night, fragmentary and visceral, filled with images that dissolved when he tried to grasp them, but left behind a residue of dread that coated his thoughts like oil on water. He had woken 3 times, each time reaching for the Colt Peacemaker on his nightstand, each time finding nothing but darkness and the sound of his own breathing, harsh and frightened in a way that shamed him. The sun was climbing now, still low enough to cast long shadows but high enough to promise heat. By afternoon, the temperature would climb past 90, and the shade would become precious currency. Thomas walked toward the center of town, past the saloon where Dutch Henry ran a quiet establishment that catered to miners and cowboys who wanted to drink their pay without getting into fights that might land them in a cell. The saloon sign creaked in the wind. The painted letters faded by years of sun until they were barely legible. Inside, he could see Dutch through the window, moving behind the bar with the slow deliberation of a man who had learned that haste caused mistakes. He walked past the general store, where Samuel Hutchins should have been opening for business, but the door remained locked, the windows dark, past the boarding house where Mary Chen ran a tight establishment that provided clean beds and hot meals for miners and travelers. The laundry should have been hanging by now, white sheets snapping in the morning breeze, but the clothesline stood empty, the wooden pins waiting for work that had not come. Past the blacksmith's forge, cold and silent, though Jacob Sterling was usually there by dawn, his hammer ringing against the anvil in a rhythm that marked the hours as reliably as any clock. Past the assayer's office, its charred timbers a reminder of how quickly prosperity could turn to ash. The building had burned on a winter night 3 years ago, taking with it not just the structure, but also Marcus Welland, the assayer who had been trapped inside. Some said it was an accident, a knocked-over lantern. Others whispered darker theories involving claim disputes and deliberate arson. Thomas had investigated, but the truth had burned along with everything else, past the church that Father Michael tended, despite a congregation that rarely numbered more than a dozen souls on any given Sunday. The white paint was peeling, revealing gray wood beneath, and the bell tower leaned slightly to the left, as if the building itself was trying to escape the weight of prayers that went unanswered. Thomas had attended services when he first arrived in Redemption Creek, seeking some kind of spiritual anchor in a place that seemed designed to erode faith. But over time, he had stopped going, not because he had lost his belief in God, but because he had come to understand that God was not particularly interested in the high desert of Wyoming, in the small struggles of small people trying to survive in a place that actively resisted human habitation. Past the doctor's office, where Benjamin Hart practiced a kind of medicine that was equal parts science and desperate improvisation. Hart was good at setting bones and treating gunshot wounds, but there was little he could do about the slow diseases that claimed people here. The lung sickness from the mines, the fevers that came and went without explanation, the mysterious wasting that turned strong men into hollowed-out shells. Thomas had seen too many people die, despite Hart's best efforts, had stood by too many bedsides, listening to final words and last confessions. Past the undertaker's parlor, where Silas Crenshaw prepared bodies for burial, with a solemnity that seemed almost excessive for a town where death was so common. Silas was a thin man with careful hands and sad eyes, and he performed his duties with a reverence that Thomas respected. In a place where life was cheap, someone needed to honor the dead, and Silas did that faithfully, even when no one else seemed to care. Something was wrong with the light. Thomas noticed it as he walked, though it took him a moment to understand what his eyes were telling him. The shadows were falling at the wrong angle, not by much, but enough to create a subtle wrongness, as if the sun had shifted slightly in its ancient path across the sky. He stopped in the middle of the street and looked up, squinting against the brightness, and for just a moment he saw something impossible. The sun had a second shadow, a dark twin that flickered and vanished even as he watched, leaving behind only the ordinary burning disk and a feeling of vertigo that made him stagger. That was when he heard the voice, not with his ears exactly. It came from somewhere deeper, somewhere inside his skull where thought and instinct tangled together. A voice like wind through a canyon, like water over stones, like the creak of a rope under weight. It spoke a single sentence, clear and undeniable. "You will die when the sun touches the horizon." Thomas stood very still. His hand had moved to his gun without conscious thought, fingers resting on the worn grip. His heart was hammering against his ribs, each beat a small violence. He turned slowly, scanning the street, the buildings, the empty windows that stared back at him like blind eyes. There was no one. Nothing but the wind and the dust, and the terrible certainty that settled over him like a shroud. He had always known he would die violently. It was the unavoidable mathematics of the life he had chosen. Every time he pinned on the badge, every time he walked into a situation that might require him to draw his weapon, he made peace with the possibility. But knowing in the abstract was different from knowing with the kind of bone-deep certainty that now filled him. He would die today, before sunset. The knowledge was absolute. Thomas walked back to his office, his legs moving automatically while his mind tried to process what was happening. Was he going mad? Had something broken inside his head, some essential mechanism that kept a man tethered to reality? He had seen it happen to others. Old Jake Morrison, who had worked the mines for 30 years and woke up one morning convinced that invisible insects were crawling under his skin. He had clawed himself bloody before they could restrain him. Sarah Dennison, who started seeing her dead children in mirrors and windows and finally walked into the desert one night and never came back. The mind was fragile. The frontier broke it more often than not, but this felt different. This felt like revelation rather than delusion, like a door had opened in the fabric of things and allowed him to see what was coming. He thought of the stories his grandmother had told him when he was a boy, stories of second sight and premonitions, of knowing when death was approaching. She had been Scottish, raised in the Highlands before immigrating to America, and she carried with her the old beliefs, the ancient understanding that some people could see beyond the veil that separated the living world from the other place. Thomas had always dismissed such talk as superstition, the kind of old-world nonsense that had no place in the modern age of steam engines and telegraph wires. But now, standing in his office with the morning light slanting through the dusty window, he was not so sure. He sat at his desk and tried to think clearly. If he was going to die today, he needed to understand why, needed to prepare. He thought through his current cases, the few threads of law enforcement that occupied his time in a town where crime was usually limited to drunken brawls and the occasional theft. There was nothing that would provoke murder, no outlaws seeking revenge, no pending arrests that might inspire someone to take preemptive action. He had checked the Telegraph yesterday, and there were no warnings about dangerous men heading this way. But then, this was not about vengeance or crime, or the usual mechanics of frontier justice. This was something else entirely, something that operated by different rules, ancient rules that predated badges and laws and the thin veneer of civilization that men like him tried to maintain in places like this. Thomas opened the bottom drawer of his desk and pulled out a bottle of whiskey he kept for difficult nights. He poured a small measure into a tin cup and drank it slowly, feeling the burn spread through his chest. The alcohol did nothing to quiet his thoughts. If anything, it sharpened them, made the clarity of his situation even more unbearable. He was going to die today, in approximately 8 hours, give or take a few minutes. The certainty was absolute. He thought about running, about saddling his horse and riding out into the desert, putting as much distance as possible between himself and Redemption Creek before sunset. But even as the thought formed, he knew it was pointless. Whatever was coming for him was not bound by geography. It would find him wherever he went. The voice had not said he would die in this town. It had said he would die when the sun touched the horizon. That would happen regardless of where he stood. Besides, There was something in him that rebelled against running. Some stubborn core of pride or duty, or simple bloody-mindedness that insisted he stay. If death was coming, let it come here, in the place where he had made his stand for the past 5 years. Let it find him in the town he had tried to protect, among the people he had tried to serve. There was dignity in that, at least. More dignity than dying alone in the desert, fleeing from the inevitable. He pulled out a sheet of paper and began to write. Not instructions yet, but a letter. "Dear Catherine," he began, writing to his sister in Ohio, whom he had not seen in 7 years. "I am writing to you on what may be my last day alive. I know how that sounds. I know you will think I have lost my mind. Perhaps I have, but I want you to know that I have tried to live well. I have tried to do right by the people under my care. I have made mistakes, Catherine, terrible mistakes. I have taken lives when perhaps there were other ways, but I did what I thought was necessary, and I have tried to bear the weight of those choices without complaint." He stopped writing and stared at the words. They seemed inadequate, pathetic even. How do you sum up a life in a letter? How do you explain to someone who knew you as a boy that you have become a man who deals in death, who carries the weight of 7 lives on his conscience, who now faces his own extinction with a strange mixture of fear and relief? He crumpled the letter and threw it in the trash. If he died today, Catherine would learn about it eventually. There was no need to burden her with his final thoughts, his inadequate attempts to justify or explain. The dead did not owe the living explanations. The dead owed nothing at all. The door opened. Deputy Frank Holloway came in, young and earnest, barely 25, still believing that the badge meant something beyond the simple exercise of force. Frank had grown up in Wyoming, the son of a rancher who had lost everything to drought and bank loans and the merciless mathematics of frontier economics. He had joined the sheriff's office 2 years ago, seeking purpose, seeking a way to make his life mean something in a place that seemed designed to render meaning impossible. Thomas had taken him on reluctantly, knowing that the job would either break him or harden him, and not being entirely sure which outcome would be worse. Frank took one look at Thomas and stopped, his hand still on the door handle. His youthful face, usually open and optimistic, clouded with concern. He had good instincts. Thomas had to give him that. He could read people, could sense when something was wrong, even when everything appeared normal on the surface. "What is wrong, Sheriff?" Frank asked, closing the door behind him and moving into the office with careful steps, as if approaching a wounded animal that might lash out. Thomas wanted to tell him, wanted to explain about the voice and the certainty and the wrongness of the light, but the words stuck in his throat. How do you tell someone that you know you are going to die in a few hours? How do you make them believe something you can barely believe yourself? More than that, how do you burden someone else with that knowledge? Especially someone as young as Frank, someone who still had hope that the world made sense. Nothing, Thomas said, just did not sleep well. Frank studied him for a moment longer, then shrugged and moved to his own desk in the corner. "You look terrible," he said. "You should go home. Get some rest. I can handle things here." Thomas almost laughed. Handle what? There was nothing to handle. The town was quiet, suspended in its usual state of slow decay. But even as he thought this, he felt the wrongness intensifying. Something was coming. He could feel it the way animals sense earthquakes before they strike. A subtle vibration in the bones, a disturbance in the invisible architecture of the world. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the empty street. The wind had picked up, blowing harder now, lifting dust in stinging clouds that made the air hazy. The sky was clear, impossibly blue, but there was a quality to it that made Thomas think of ice, of depths that went on forever, cold and indifferent. He checked his pocket watch. 9:30 in the morning. Sunset would come at approximately 6:45, 9 hours and 15 minutes. That was how much life he had left. The thought should have terrified him, should have sent him into panic or denial or desperate attempts to flee. But instead he felt a strange calm settling over him, heavy and final. If death was coming, he would meet it on his feet. He would face it the way he had faced everything else in his life, with whatever courage he could muster. There was a kind of freedom in certainty, he realized. No more wondering when or how, just the simple fact of an ending, approaching with the inevitability of the sun sinking toward the western mountains. But there was one thing he needed to do, one final preparation that felt necessary in a way he could not fully articulate. He needed to dig his grave. The thought came to him fully formed, carrying with it the same inexorable certainty as the voice. He would dig his own grave. He would prepare his own resting place. There was logic in it, brutal and practical. If he was going to die in this town, someone would have to bury him. Better to do it himself. Better to have control over this one last thing. Thomas turned from the window. Frank was writing something in the ledger, his head bent over the page, utterly absorbed in the mundane task. Thomas watched him for a moment. This young man who still believed the world made sense, who thought that order could be imposed on chaos through diligence and good intentions. He felt a sudden fierce protectiveness toward Frank, a desire to shield him from what was coming. But there was no shield. There never had been. "I am going out," Thomas said. "Need to take care of something." Frank looked up. "Want me to come with you?" "No, stay here. If anyone needs me, tell them I will be back later." He walked out before Frank could ask more questions, strapping on his gun belt and settling his hat low against the sun. The heat was building now, pressing down on the town like a weight. Thomas could feel sweat already beginning to gather under his arms at the small of his back. The leather of his gun belt was warm against his waist, the weight of the Colt familiar and useless. He walked past the last buildings, heading toward the cemetery that occupied a scrub-covered rise on the eastern edge of Redemption Creek. The walk took perhaps 10 minutes, but it felt longer, each step carrying him closer to a task that seemed to exist outside normal reality. He passed the last house, a sad little structure where the widow Abernathy lived alone with too many cats and not enough hope. She was standing in her doorway, watching him pass, her wrinkled face creased with worry. She did not call out to him, but he could feel her eyes on his back as he walked on, could feel the weight of her unspoken questions. The cemetery occupied a scrub-covered rise on the eastern edge of town, a small plot of consecrated ground that seemed almost defiant in its existence, as if daring the desert to reclaim it. It was a small plot, maybe 60 graves, marked by simple wooden crosses and the occasional stone marker purchased by families who had the money and the sentimentality to invest in permanent remembrance. Most of the crosses were weathered gray, the names carved into them fading with each passing season, becoming illegible, returning the dead to anonymity. The people buried here had names like Abraham Stokes and Martha Tillery, and John no last name, their stories reduced to dates that told you when they were born and when they died, but nothing about what happened in between. Abraham Stokes had been a miner who fell down a shaft and broke his neck. Martha Tillery had died in childbirth, taking her baby with her. John no last name had been found dead in an alley behind the saloon, stabbed 3 times in the back, and no one had ever claimed his body or even known his real name. These were the anonymous dead, the forgotten ones, and Thomas was about to join them. There was a shed near the cemetery entrance, a ramshackle structure that leaned heavily to one side and looked as if a strong wind might finally put it out of its misery. This was where old Pete Marsh kept his tools, shovels, picks, rakes, and other implements of burial. Thomas found a shovel. its blade worn smooth from years of cutting into the hard earth, the wooden handle dark with the stain of countless hands and countless graves. He hefted it, feeling its weight, the way it balanced, and for a moment he was transported back to his childhood, to helping his father dig fence post holes on their small farm in Pennsylvania. That had been before the war, before everything changed, back when death was still an abstraction and a shovel was just a tool for honest work. He walked into the cemetery, looking for the right spot. The earth here was hard, baked by sun and starved of water, and he knew the digging would be brutal. But that was fitting somehow. Nothing about today should be easy. Nothing about preparing for your own death should come without cost. There, near the back, beneath a twisted juniper tree that provided a small circle of shade. That would do. The tree was old, ancient perhaps, its trunk gnarled and its branches reaching out in arthritic curves that suggested centuries of survival in this hostile place. There was something comforting about the tree, something that spoke of endurance and persistence. If he had to spend eternity anywhere, beneath this tree seemed as good a place as any. Thomas set the shovel blade against the ground and pushed down with his boot. The earth resisted, baked hard by the relentless sun, compressed by months without significant rain. The blade barely penetrated. He adjusted his stance, put more weight into it, pushed harder. The blade bit through with a small crunching sound, breaking the crust. He lifted the shovel, threw the dirt aside, set the blade again, lift and throw, lift and throw. The rhythm was mindless, almost meditative, and he let himself sink into it, focusing on the simple physical act rather than the metaphysical horror of what he was doing. The sun climbed higher. The small patch of shade provided by the juniper tree shifted as the earth turned on its axis, the ancient dance that measured out days and lives and deaths with mechanical precision. Thomas worked steadily, methodically. His shirt was soaked through now, clinging to his back, his shoulders. Blisters formed on his palms where the shovel handle rubbed, small bubbles of fluid that burst and bled and formed again. He ignored the pain. Pain was honest. Pain was real. Pain was something he could understand and endure. Sweat began to soak his shirt. His hands, soft from years spent more often holding a pen than a shovel, began to blister. But he kept digging. The hole grew deeper, a dark rectangle opening in the earth like a wound. 1 foot, 2 feet. The dirt changed as he dug deeper, becoming cooler, damper, darker. 3 feet, 4 feet. The sun climbed higher, measuring out the hours of his life in its slow arc across the sky. The walls of the grave began to close in around him, the hole narrowing his world to this one task, this one purpose. At 4 feet, he hit rock, a large stone embedded in the earth, too big to dig around easily. He considered giving up, finding another spot, starting over. But no, this was the place. This was where he would rest. He attacked the rock with the shovel, chipping away at the earth around it, working the blade underneath, using leverage to shift it. His shoulders screamed, his back protested, sweat stung his eyes. But finally, the rock came loose, a great oblong mass that he wrestled up and out of the hole, letting it thud onto the ground beside the growing pile of excavated earth. 5 feet deep now. He could barely see over the edge of the grave when he stood at the bottom. The world had narrowed to this hole in the ground, to the physical labor of digging, to the scrape of shovel against earth, and the burn of overworked muscles. He had lost track of time. The sun was his only clock, and it showed him that hours had passed, hours carved out of his remaining life, spent in this brutal preparation. 6 feet, the standard depth, deep enough to keep animals from digging up the body, deep enough to separate the dead from the living, deep enough to ensure that what was buried stayed buried. Thomas's shoulders ached, with a deep grinding pain that radiated down his arms and into his hands. His palms were raw meat, the blisters long since burst, the skin beneath red and weeping. Every movement hurt, every breath was labored, but he kept working, driven by the terrible need to complete this final act of preparation. He did not hear Pete Marsh approach until the old man spoke. "Sheriff, what in the hell are you doing?" Thomas stopped digging and looked up. Pete was standing at the edge of the grave, his weathered face creased with confusion and concern. He was 70 if he was a day, bent from decades of digging graves for people who died too young, in a place that killed with casual indifference. "Digging a grave," Thomas said. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, flat and distant. "I can see that." Pete's eyes narrowed. "Whose grave?" "Mine." The word hung in the air between them. Pete stared at him, trying to process what he had just heard. "You are not making sense, Sheriff. You sick? You hurt?" Thomas climbed out of the hole, standing on the edge. He was filthy now, covered in dust and sweat, his hands bleeding from burst blisters. He looked Pete in the eye. "I am going to die today, before sunset. I know how this sounds, but it is true. So I am digging my grave. When it happens, you will know I was right." Pete took a step back. His hand moved unconsciously to his chest, fingers splaying over his heart as if to ward off evil. "You have lost your mind." "Maybe." Thomas picked up the shovel again. "But I am going to finish this anyway." He dropped back into the hole and resumed digging. Pete stood there for a long moment, watching, then turned and walked away quickly, muttering under his breath. Thomas did not care. Let them think he was crazy. Let them whisper about the sheriff who lost his mind and dug his own grave. None of it mattered. The only thing that mattered was finishing this task before the end came. The hole grew deeper, 5 feet, 6 feet, the standard depth, deep enough to keep animals from digging up the body, deep enough to separate the dead from the living. Thomas's shoulders ached. His hands were raw meat, but he kept working, driven by the terrible need to complete this final act of preparation. Above him, the sun continued its journey, indifferent and eternal. When he finally climbed out, the grave was done. A perfect rectangle, 6 feet deep, 3 feet wide, 7 feet long. Enough room for a body laid out straight, arms crossed over the chest. Thomas stood at the edge and looked down into the darkness. "This is where I will spend eternity," he thought. "This hole in the ground, beneath the juniper tree, in a cemetery on the edge of a dying town that no one will remember in 100 years. He should have felt despair, should have felt the weight of his own mortality crushing him, but instead, he felt only that strange calm, that acceptance. He had made his peace. Now all that remained was to wait for whatever was coming. Thomas walked back to town. It was past noon now. The sun was directly overhead, bleaching the world white, casting almost no shadows, turning the desert into a furnace. The walk back was harder than the walk out had been. His body was exhausted, his hands ruined, his clothes soaked with sweat and dirt. But more than that, something had shifted inside him during the digging. Some final barrier between him and his fate had dissolved, leaving him feeling strangely light, almost euphoric. He had prepared his resting place. He had done what needed to be done. Now all that remained was waiting. The street was still empty, but now there were signs of life behind the windows. Curtains twitching at the boarding house. Faces peering out from the general store, quickly withdrawing when they saw him looking. A group of men standing in the shadows of the saloon's porch, their conversation stopping as he approached, their eyes following him with a mixture of fear and morbid fascination. They knew what he had done. News traveled fast in a small town, carried on whispers and speculation, growing and mutating with each retelling until it became something larger than the original fact. He went to the saloon. The interior was dim and blessedly cool after the brutal heat outside. The smell of old beer and tobacco and unwashed men hung in the air, familiar and oddly comforting. Dutch Henry was behind the bar, polishing glasses with a rag that had probably not been clean in years. He was a big man, running to fat now in his middle years, but still capable when he needed to be. His broad face was weathered and lined, his gray-streaked hair pulled back in a ponytail that made him look vaguely piratical. He had been many things in his life: soldier, prospector, buffalo hunter, before settling into the role of saloon keeper in a town that barely had enough people to support one. Dutch looked up as Thomas entered, his broad face unreadable. For a long moment, neither man spoke. There was an understanding between them, forged over 5 years of quiet acquaintance, of shared drinks and occasional confidences. Dutch was not exactly a friend. Thomas had learned long ago that lawmen did not have friends, not really. But he was someone Thomas respected, someone whose counsel he valued. "Heard you were digging graves," Dutch said finally, setting down the glass he had been polishing. His voice was gravelly, roughened by years of whiskey and cigars. "Your own, supposedly." Thomas sat at the bar, feeling his abused muscles protest the movement. He could smell himself, the rank odor of hard labor and fierce sweat. He probably looked like hell, felt like it too. "Whiskey," he said. Dutch poured without comment, sliding the glass across the scarred wood with practiced ease. The glass was not particularly clean, but Thomas did not care. He drank it in one swallow, feeling the burn, welcoming it. The whiskey was cheap and harsh, but it was real. It was something solid in a day that had become increasingly unmoored from reality. Another. Dutch poured again. "You want to talk about it?" he asked, his tone carefully neutral, neither judging nor dismissing. Thomas stared at the amber liquid in his glass, watching how the light from the window caught it, turned it into something almost beautiful. "What is there to say? I woke up this morning knowing I was going to die today. I do not know how I know. I just do. It is as certain as my own name. So I dug a grave. Seemed like the practical thing to do." Dutch studied him for a long moment, his dark eyes searching Thomas's face for signs of madness or deception. "You are serious?" "As the grave I just dug." Thomas drank more slowly this time, letting the whiskey sit on his tongue before swallowing. "How many men do you think have known the exact day they would die? Really known it with absolute certainty?" "Not many." Dutch poured himself a drink, something he rarely did before evening, unless they were on a gallows or facing a firing squad. And even then there is always hope for a pardon, a rescue, some miracle. "You are saying there is no miracle coming for you?" Thomas shook his head. "No miracle, just certainty. When the sun touches the horizon, I will die. That is all I know." They sat in silence for a while. The only sound the tick of the clock on the wall and the whisper of wind under the eaves. The clock was old and not particularly accurate, running sometimes fast and sometimes slow, as if time itself was negotiable in a place like Redemption Creek. Thomas drank slowly now, rationing the whiskey, wanting to stay clear-headed. If death was coming, he wanted to see it, wanted to understand. Dutch drank with him, matching him glass for glass, a silent companion in this strange vigil. "Can I ask you something, Dutch?" Thomas said finally, breaking the comfortable silence. "Sure. Do you believe in fate? In knowing when you are going to die?" Dutch considered this, swirling the whiskey in his glass, watching the liquid coat the sides and slowly slide back down. "My mother did," he said finally. "She was Lakota, Grew up on the plains before the reservations, before everything changed. She believed the ancestors could speak to you, warn you, give you visions. I remember she told me once about a cousin of hers, a young warrior who woke up one morning and told everyone he would die that day in battle. They tried to keep him from fighting, but he insisted, said it was his day. And sure enough, an arrow took him before sunset, just like he said. Did she ever have visions? Thomas asked. Once. Dutch's face grew distant, remembering. When I was a boy, she woke up screaming one night, saying she had seen my father's death. Said he would drown in the river 3 days hence. My father laughed it off. He was a strong swimmer. The river was low, but 3 days later his horse spooked. While crossing, threw him, and the current took him. They found his body 2 miles downstream. Dutch drank deeply. After that, I never knew if I believed it or not. Never had reason to, really. Never had visions of my own. But I never forgot what happened to my father, either. Thomas absorbed this, feeling a strange kinship with Dutch's mother, with that long-dead Lakota woman who had seen beyond the veil and tried to warn those she loved. Maybe this kind of knowing ran in certain bloodlines. Maybe some people were simply closer to the other side, could hear whispers from beyond that others missed. His grandmother had believed such things. She had told him stories of the Highland seers, people who could see the future, who knew when death was approaching. The second sight, she called it, a gift or a curse, depending on how you looked at it. I am going to die today, Thomas said again, as if saying it aloud might make it less real or more real. He was not sure which. I know it the way I know my own name, and I know it will happen when the sun sets. I do not know how, do not know why, but I know it is coming. Dutch did not laugh, did not call him crazy. He just nodded slowly, accepting the statement with the same stolid pragmatism he brought to everything. Then you better make your peace, Sheriff. I am trying. You afraid? The question hung in the air. Thomas thought about it, really thought about it, examining his emotional state with as much honesty as he could muster. Was he afraid? There was fear, certainly. A baseline terror that hummed in his bones, that made his heart beat faster than it should. But underneath that, there was something else. Something that might have been relief. He had carried the weight of his badge for 20 years, had made impossible choices, had killed and hurt and broken people in the name of law. He was tired, so tired, and the prospect of rest, of finally putting down that weight, held a certain appeal. Yes, he said finally, but not as much as I thought I would be. More than anything, I am curious. What comes next? What waits on the other side? I will know soon enough. Any regrets? Thomas laughed, a short, bitter sound. 7, at least. 1 for each man I killed. Maybe more. I have not always been the man I wanted to be. Have not always made the right choices, but I did the best I could with what I knew at the time. That has to count for something. It counts for everything, Dutch said quietly. We are all just doing the best we can. Anyone who tells you different is selling something. They drank in companionable silence, 2 men contemplating mortality in the dim interior of a frontier saloon. Outside, the sun continued its inexorable journey across the sky, measuring out the remaining hours of Thomas Wardell's life with astronomical precision. Thomas left the saloon an hour later, his steps steadier than they had been, the whiskey settling into his system with a familiar warmth. The sun had begun its descent, still high but moving inexorably toward the mountains. He had perhaps 4 hours left, maybe less. The light was changing now, becoming softer, the harsh white glare of noon giving way to something gentler, more forgiving. It was the kind of afternoon light that photographers loved, that painters tried to capture, that made even ugly things beautiful for a little while. He walked to the church, his body aching with every step. The grave digging had taken more out of him than he had realized. His hands throbbed, the raw flesh sending sharp pulses of pain up his arms with each movement. His back was a solid mass of complaining muscle, but the pain was good in a way. It kept him anchored to his body, to the physical world, when everything else seemed to be dissolving into unreality. The church stood at the northern end of town, a simple wooden structure painted white, though years of sun and wind had faded the paint to a dingy gray. The bell tower rose above the rest of the building, leaning slightly to the left, a result of poor foundation work and the relentless pressure of Wyoming winters. Father Michael had been trying to raise money to repair it for 3 years now, but in a town where most people struggled to afford food and shelter, charitable donations for church maintenance were not exactly abundant. Thomas pushed open the heavy wooden door, its hinges creaking in protest, and stepped into the cool dimness. The interior smelled of old wood and candle wax, and the faint incense that Father Michael used during Mass. Dust motes danced in the colored light that filtered through the stained glass windows, cheap imitations of the grand windows in European cathedrals, but beautiful in their own humble way. The windows depicted familiar scenes: Christ on the cross, Mary holding the infant Jesus, various saints whose names Thomas could never remember. But the colors were lovely, deep blues and reds and greens that transformed the ordinary sunlight into something transcendent. Father Michael was there, kneeling before the altar in an attitude of prayer, his white hair gleaming in the multicolored light. He was a small man, barely 5.5 feet tall, thin to the point of frailty, but there was a strength in him that belied his physical appearance. He had been a missionary once, traveling through the most dangerous parts of the frontier, bringing the gospel to people who often responded with violence rather than conversion. He had been shot twice, stabbed once, and beaten more times than he could count. But he had persevered, driven by a faith that Thomas both admired and found somewhat baffling. The priest looked up as Thomas approached, his weathered face creasing with concern. Michael was perhaps 60, though the hardships of frontier life made it difficult to judge. His blue eyes were still sharp, still possessed of a penetrating quality that made Thomas feel as if he were being looked through rather than looked at. "My son," he said, rising stiffly from his knees, his joints cracking audibly in the quiet church. "I heard you have been doing something unusual today." Thomas sat in the front pew, the wood hard and uncomfortable beneath him. The pew was old, donated by some well-meaning soul years ago, carved with initials and crude drawings by bored children, forced to sit through sermons that meant nothing to them. "I need to confess," he said, though he had not come here with that intention. The words simply emerged, unbidden. Father Michael moved toward the confessional, but Thomas shook his head. "No, here is fine. I want to look you in the eye." The priest hesitated, then nodded and sat beside him in the pew, his weathered hands folded in his lap, the hands of a man who had worked hard all his life, who had built churches and dug wells and tended to the sick and dying in places where there were no doctors. "Very well," he said softly. "Speak." Thomas told him everything. The voice that had spoken to him in the street, carrying with it the absolute certainty of his impending death, the wrongness of the light, the shadow that should not have been there, the grave he had dug for himself, preparing for an end he could not prevent but could at least meet with dignity. Father Michael listened without interruption, his face grave and attentive, his eyes never leaving Thomas's face. When Thomas finished, the priest was quiet for a long time, his thin frame motionless in the pew, his eyes focused on the altar at the front of the church. The silence stretched, broken only by the distant sound of wind and the occasional creak of settling wood. Finally, Father Michael spoke, his voice soft but steady. "Do you believe you are being punished?" he asked, not looking at Thomas but continuing to stare at the simple wooden cross that hung above the altar. "For the men you have killed?" Thomas considered this. The question had been circling in his mind all day, never quite landing, never quite forming into something he could examine clearly. "I do not know," he admitted. "Maybe. I have killed men. 7 of them, all in the line of duty. But dead is dead. Their lives ended because of choices I made. Because I was faster, or luckier, or more willing to pull the trigger. Maybe this is payment for those lives. Blood for blood." Father Michael shook his head slowly. "God is not a bookkeeper, my son. He does not tally sins and extract payment with mathematical precision. That would make him a merchant, and our relationship with the divine would be nothing more than a transaction. That is not how grace works. That is not how mercy operates." "Then what is this?" Thomas spread his hands, wincing at the pain in his raw palms. "Why am I being given this knowledge? Why am I being told the hour of my death? What purpose does it serve?" Father Michael stood and walked to the altar, his thin frame casting a long shadow in the colored light. He touched the smooth wood as if drawing strength from it, his fingers tracing the grain with familiar affection. "Sometimes," he said slowly, choosing his words with care, "God grants us visions not as punishment but as gift, a chance to prepare, a chance to make our peace. Most men die suddenly, without warning. One moment they are alive, vital, going about their business, and the next they are simply gone. No time to say goodbye, no time to settle accounts, no time to prepare their souls for the journey ahead. But you have been given time, time to dig my grave, time to face what is coming with open eyes." Father Michael turned to look at him, and there was something in his expression that might have been envy. "That is no small thing, Thomas. Do you not see? You have been granted what most men would give everything to possess: foreknowledge, the ability to make your final hours count, to speak the words you need to speak, to do the things you need to do, to make whatever peace you need to make with God and man." Thomas felt something loosen in his chest, some tight knot of fear and confusion beginning to unravel. He had not thought of it that way, had been so focused on the horror of knowing, on the terrible weight of certainty, that he had not considered the possibility that this might be anything other than a curse. "You are afraid," Father Michael said, and it was not a question. "That is natural. That is human. Our Lord himself felt fear in the Garden of Gethsemane, praying that the cup might pass from him. But fear is not faithlessness. Fear is simply an acknowledgement of reality. We are mortal. We are fragile. And death is the great unknown, the threshold we all must cross, but none can describe. To fear, it is not weakness. To face it despite that fear, that is courage. I do not feel courageous. Few people do." Father Michael returned to the pew, sitting down with a sigh. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is action in the face of fear. You could have run this morning, could have saddled your horse and ridden as far and as fast as you could. But you stayed. You prepared. You faced the knowledge of your death head-on. That is courage, or stupidity, perhaps. The priest allowed himself a small smile. The line between courage and stupidity is often thinner than we like to admit. But I do not think you are being stupid. I think you are doing what you must do, what your soul requires of you. They sat together in silence, two men contemplating mysteries that had no answers, questions that had been asked for thousands of years without resolution. What comes after death? Is there judgment? Is there mercy? Is there anything at all? Or just darkness and oblivion? These were the great unknowns, The questions that haunted every thinking person, that drove some to faith and others to despair. "Can I ask you something, Father?" Thomas said finally. "Of course. Do you ever doubt? Do you ever wonder if all of this, the faith, the prayers, the belief in something beyond, is just a way of making ourselves feel better about the fact that we die? A story we tell ourselves because the alternative is too terrible to contemplate?" Father Michael looked at him for a long moment, and there was something raw and honest in his eyes. "Every day," he said quietly, "every single day I wake up and wonder if I have devoted my life to a beautiful lie. If the comfort I offer people is nothing more than false hope. If when we die, we simply cease, and all the prayers and all the faith and all the love we poured into the idea of salvation was for nothing." Thomas was surprised by the admission. "I thought priests were supposed to be certain, supposed to have unshakable faith, supposed to..." "Yes." Father Michael smiled sadly. "But we are still human, still subject to doubt and fear and all the weaknesses of the flesh. Faith is not certainty, Thomas. Faith is choosing to believe despite the lack of certainty. It is walking forward into darkness, trusting that there is light ahead, even when you cannot see it. Anyone can believe when proof is provided. Faith requires believing without proof, and you still believe, despite the doubt. I still believe, not because I have proof, not because I have been granted visions or miracles that would dispel all uncertainty, but because I have seen what faith does for people. I have watched it transform fear into peace. I have seen it give dying people comfort in their final moments. I have witnessed it change lives, open hearts, create community in places where there was only isolation. Does that prove God exists? No, but it proves that believing in God has value, has power, has the ability to make this difficult life a little more bearable. And that is enough for me." Thomas absorbed this, feeling something shift inside him. He had come here seeking answers, seeking some kind of theological certainty that would make sense of what was happening to him. But instead, Father Michael had offered him something more valuable. Permission to doubt while still moving forward. Permission to be afraid while still being brave. Permission to face the unknown without pretending to understand it. "Thank you," Thomas said simply. Father Michael reached over and placed his thin hand on Thomas's shoulder. "When your moment comes, my son, remember that you are not alone. Whatever waits on the other side, you do not go to meet it unaccompanied. You carry with you the love of everyone who has cared for you, the memory of every good thing you have done, the weight of a life lived with intention and purpose. That is not nothing. That is never nothing." Thomas left the church feeling no better than when he entered, but somehow less alone. The sky was beginning to change now, taking on that deeper blue that preceded evening. The shadows were lengthening, reaching across the street like dark fingers. He checked his watch. 3:30. 3 hours and 15 minutes. The countdown continued, inexorable and absolute. He walked to his office. Frank was pacing, agitated, and he spun around when Thomas entered. "Sheriff, what is happening? People are talking. They are saying you have gone mad, that you dug a grave for yourself. Tell me it is not true." "It is true." Frank stared at him. "Why?" "Because I am going to die today, before sunset. I do not expect you to understand. I do not fully understand it myself, but it is real. This is insane. You are not dying. You are fine. Look at you. You are standing right here. For now." Thomas sat at his desk and began writing. "If I am wrong, you can mock me tomorrow. But if I am right, I need you to know some things." He wrote steadily, filling pages with instructions about his affairs, such as they were. His few possessions, the small amount of money in his bank account, letters to be sent to his sister in Ohio, his brother in California. When he finished, he sealed the papers in an envelope and handed them to Frank. "If something happens to me today, you will find everything you need in here." Frank took the envelope with trembling hands. "I do not want this. Neither do I." But we do not always get what we want. The afternoon stretched and contracted in strange ways, time becoming elastic and unreliable. Thomas sat at his desk, cleaning his gun, loading fresh rounds, though some part of him knew it would not matter. Whatever was coming could not be stopped with bullets. But the ritual was comforting. The familiar weight of the Colt in his hand, the smell of gun oil and metal. At 5 o'clock, as the shadows lengthened and the quality of light shifted toward evening, the door to the sheriff's office opened. Thomas looked up from where he had been sitting, staring at nothing, his thoughts scattered and strange. He had been thinking about his childhood, about the farm in Pennsylvania, about his father teaching him to shoot, about his mother singing hymns while she worked in the kitchen. Strange how the mind worked when confronted with mortality, reaching back to the beginning, perhaps trying to make sense of the entire arc of a life before it ended. The person standing in the doorway was not someone Thomas recognized, and in a town the size of Redemption Creek, that was unusual. Everyone knew everyone, for better or worse. There were no strangers here, not really. Just familiar faces grown more familiar through constant exposure. But this man was a stranger, tall and thin, dressed entirely in black. Black pants, black vest, black coat, black hat, with a wide brim that shadowed his face. The outfit was expensive, Thomas noted automatically, the kind of thing a professional gambler might wear, or a successful businessman from back east. The fabric was fine, the cut precise. This was not the rough clothing of a frontier drifter. The stranger stood in the doorway for a long moment, not moving, not speaking, just watching. The afternoon light behind him created a halo effect, making it difficult to see his face clearly, turning him into a silhouette, a dark shape cut out of the light. Thomas felt his skin crawl. There was something wrong about this man. Something that set off every instinct Thomas had developed over 20 years of reading danger in men's faces and bodies. This was not just another person. This was something else, something other. "Can I help you?" Thomas said, his hand moving to his gun. The movement was automatic, trained, the response of a man who had survived this long by trusting his instincts. But even as his fingers closed around the grip of the Colt, some part of him knew it would not matter. Whatever this stranger was, whatever he represented, bullets would not stop him. The stranger smiled. It was a terrible smile, empty and cold, the kind of expression that had nothing to do with humor or warmth, and everything to do with something far older and far less human. His teeth were white, too white, almost luminous in the shadows. "No, Sheriff," he said, his voice like wind through a canyon, like water over stones, like the creak of rope under weight. "But I can help you. I can tell you what is coming." The voice was the same voice Thomas had heard that morning in the street, not with his ears, but with something deeper, something that bypassed normal sensory channels and spoke directly to the part of him that understood without needing explanation. Recognition flooded through him, along with a terror so profound, it made his previous fear seem trivial by comparison. This was not a man. This was the thing itself. The voice made manifest. Death, wearing a human shape. "Who are you?" Thomas asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. The stranger stepped into the office, and as he did, the light seemed to dim, as if his presence absorbed illumination, pulled it into himself like a black hole pulling in matter. The shadows in the room deepened, grew longer, reached out with dark fingers that seemed almost alive. "I am what you have been feeling all day," he said, moving with a grace that was too smooth, too fluid, lacking the small imperfections that characterized normal human movement. I am the knowledge in your bones. I am the voice that spoke to you this morning. I am the certainty that has followed you from dawn until now. Thomas stood slowly, his hand still on the gun, though he made no move to draw it. Frank was at his desk in the corner, and Thomas could see from his peripheral vision that the deputy had frozen, his young face white with shock, his mouth open as if to speak but unable to form words. The stranger's attention, however, was focused entirely on Thomas, as if Frank did not exist, as if nothing existed except the two of them and the conversation they were having. "You are going to tell me that I cannot stop this," Thomas said, surprised by how steady his voice sounded, "that my death is inevitable, that there is no escaping what comes. Your death is always inevitable," the stranger replied, moving closer with those two fluid steps. "That is the nature of being human. You are born, you live, you die. That cycle is as old as time itself, as certain as the sun rising and setting. But today, yes, your death comes for you in a particular way. At a particular time, when the sun touches the horizon, you will cease to be. This has been decided." "By whom?" Thomas demanded, anger suddenly cutting through his fear. "By God, by fate, by whatever cosmic force you represent. Who decides such things?" The stranger tilted his head, and in the shifting shadows, Thomas caught a glimpse of his face. It was ancient and ageless at the same time, neither young nor old, possessed of a strange beauty that was also terrible. The optics were wrong, too dark, too deep, like looking into wells that had no bottom, into abysses that went on forever, containing within them the accumulated weight of every death that had ever occurred, and every death yet to come. "Does it matter?" the stranger asked. "You have spent your life dealing in violence, Sheriff. 20 years of enforcing order through force. 7 men dead by your hand, their lives ended because you decided they needed to end. How many more injured, maimed, broken by your actions? You have left a trail of blood behind you wherever you have gone. Every town where you have worn a badge has been marked by that blood. Do you think such things come without cost? Do you think you can walk through life dealing death and not eventually have to face it yourself?" "I was doing my job," Thomas said, but the words sounded weak even to his own ears. "I was enforcing the law, protecting people. Those men I killed were criminals, outlaws, murderers themselves." "Yes," the stranger agreed, nodding slowly, "and your job required you to become intimate with death, to deal it out, to stand in its presence again and again, to make split-second decisions about who lived and who died, to play God in the dust and heat of frontier towns where there was no other law but the law you imposed. Do you think such intimacy comes without cost? Do you think you can touch death so often and not have it touch you back?" Thomas felt something cold settle in his stomach. He had never thought of it that way, had never considered that his proximity to death, his professional relationship with violence, might create some kind of debt that would eventually come due. He had always seen himself as an agent of order, of justice, however rough and imperfect, but perhaps the stranger was right. Perhaps there was a cost to dealing in death, a spiritual toll that had to be paid. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I want nothing," the stranger said, and there was something almost regretful in his tone. "I am merely here to witness, to be present for the moment when you understand. You have been given a gift today, Sheriff, the gift of foreknowledge, the gift of time to prepare. Most people die without warning, torn suddenly from life with no chance to say goodbye, to make peace, to understand what is happening to them. But you knew from the moment the sun rose that it would be your last day, and you have used that time well. You dug your grave, you made your preparations, You sought counsel from friends and spiritual advisors. You have done everything you could to face what is coming with dignity and courage. Then tell me, Thomas said, his voice harder now, more demanding. Tell me what is coming. How will I die? Will it be violent? Will there be pain? The stranger shook his head slowly. You will know soon enough. When the sun touches the horizon, you will know everything. Until then, the knowledge would only be a burden. Better to wait. Better to spend these final hours not knowing, not anticipating, not fearing. Just being, just existing in the moment. Thomas wanted to argue, to demand more information, to insist on his right to know the specifics of his own death. But even as the impulse formed, he realized the stranger was right. Knowing the details would not make it easier, would not make him braver, would only give him something concrete to fear, to obsess over, to let poison these last few hours. Better to remain in uncertainty, better to face the unknown as unknown. The stranger moved toward the door, his movements creating strange patterns in the shadows, as if reality itself was bending around him. Remember this, Sheriff, he said, pausing at the threshold. You are not being punished. You are not being singled out for some cosmic retribution. This is simply your time. Everyone has their time. Yours comes today, and you have faced it better than most would. You have shown courage and dignity in the face of the unknowable. That matters. That counts for something. Then he was gone, not walking out, not opening the door and stepping through it, simply no longer there, as if he had never existed at all, as if the entire conversation had been a dream or a hallucination. Thomas stood frozen, his heart hammering, his breath coming in short gasps. The shadows in the room returned to normal. The light stabilized. The sense of wrongness of other gradually faded, leaving behind only the ordinary afternoon office with its scarred desk and dusty windows and the lingering smell of old paper and gun oil. Frank was staring at the space where the stranger had been, his face white with shock, his hands trembling on the desk. His eyes were wide, the pupils dilated, and Thomas could see the rapid pulse beating in his throat. The deputy looked like a man who had glimpsed something his mind was not equipped to process, something that violated every rule about how reality was supposed to work. Did you see him? Thomas asked, his own voice shaking despite his best efforts to control it. Frank nodded slowly, mechanically, like a marionette controlled by clumsy strings. What was that? He whispered. That was not a man. That was... I do not know what that was, but it was not human. No, Thomas agreed. It was not. What did it want? Thomas sat down heavily in his chair, suddenly exhausted, as if the encounter had drained something essential from him. To witness, he said. To be there when I die, to see what happens. Frank stood up, his movements jerky and uncoordinated, driven by fear and a desperate need to do something, anything, that might make sense of what they had just experienced. We should leave, he said urgently. We should get out of town, ride as far as we can before sunset. Maybe if you are not here, maybe if you are somewhere else, it cannot find you. Thomas shook his head. It does not matter where I am. This is not about location. This is about time. When the sun touches the horizon, wherever I am, whatever I am doing, I will die. Running will not change that. Nothing will change it. Then what do we do? Thomas looked at his watch. 6 o'clock, 45 minutes. We wait, he said quietly. There is nothing else to do. The sun was low now, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, colors that seemed too vivid, too intense, as if the world was burning. Thomas walked out onto the porch, Frank following behind him. The street was empty again. Everyone had retreated behind closed doors and locked windows. They could feel it too, Thomas realized. The whole town could feel something coming. "Sheriff," Frank said quietly, "whatever happens, I want you to know that you have been a good man, a good lawman, better than this place deserved." Thomas looked at him. "Thank you. Take care of this town when I am gone. It will need someone. I will try." They stood together in silence, watching the sun sink lower. The wind had died completely. The air was perfectly still, holding its breath. Thomas felt a strange peace settling over him. He had done what he could, made his preparations, said his goodbyes, such as they were. Now there was nothing left but to wait. At 6:30, he walked out into the middle of the street. Frank tried to follow, but Thomas waved him back. "This is mine," he said. "Stay there." He stood alone in the center of Redemption Creek, facing west, watching the sun descend toward the mountains. The sky was aflame now, brilliant crimson and gold, colors that hurt to look at. 15 minutes, 10, 5. The stranger appeared again, standing at the far end of the street, waiting. Thomas felt no fear, only curiosity, only the need to understand. The sun touched the horizon. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Thomas felt something break inside his chest. Not pain, not exactly. More like a dissolution, a coming apart of the structures that held him together. He looked down and saw his hands beginning to fade, becoming transparent, and he understood. He was not going to be killed. He was going to simply cease. The voice had been literal. He would die when the sun set. Not violently, not dramatically, just stop being. He thought of his grandmother's stories, of people who were taken by the other world, who stepped across the threshold between life and death, without violence, without struggle. He thought of the 7 men he had killed, and wondered if they were waiting for him on the other side. He thought of all the years he had lived, all the choices he had made, all the moments that had led him to this street, in this dying town, on this particular evening. The sun sank below the mountains. The light changed, became softer, gentler, the fierce colors fading to purple and blue. Thomas felt himself fading with it, his substance draining away like water through cupped hands. He looked at Frank, standing on the porch, tears streaming down his young face. He wanted to tell him it was all right, that there was no pain, that this was just the natural end of things. But his voice was gone. His body was gone. Only his consciousness remained, hovering for one last moment in the space where he had stood. Then even that was gone. Sheriff Thomas Wardell ceased to exist, precisely as the last sliver of sun disappeared behind the western mountains. His clothes fell to the dust, empty. His gun clattered to the ground. Where he had been standing, there was nothing but shadow, and the memory of a man who had known when he would die, and had faced that knowledge with whatever courage he could muster. Frank ran into the street, fell to his knees beside the empty clothes. He picked up the sheriff's badge, held it against his chest, and sobbed. The town held its breath. The night came on, deep and cold, and Redemption Creek was quieter than it had ever been. The next morning, Frank and Dutch Henry and old Pete Marsh carried the sheriff's clothes to the cemetery. They placed them in the grave Thomas had dug for himself, beneath the juniper tree. Father Michael said words over the empty grave, prayers for a man who had been taken by something beyond their understanding. They filled in the hole, packed the dirt tight, placed a simple wooden cross at the head. Sheriff Thomas Wardell. The cross read, 1852 to 1894. He knew. The town never spoke of what happened that evening. It was too strange, too far outside the boundaries of acceptable reality. But they remembered. They remembered the sheriff who had dug his own grave before the sun went down, who had faced his death with open eyes, who had been taken not by violence but by something older and stranger, something that came with the sunset and left nothing behind but questions. Years later, when Redemption Creek finally died, when the last residents packed up and moved on to places that held more promise and less shadow, the cemetery remained. The crosses slowly rotted and fell. The names faded from memory, but the juniper tree still stood, twisted and ancient, and beneath it, the grave where a lawman rested, having kept his final appointment with death. Some frontiers were never meant to be crossed. Some knowledge was never meant to be possessed. Sheriff Thomas Wardell had crossed that frontier, had possessed that knowledge, and in doing so, had learned the oldest truth of all, that death comes for everyone, whether they see it coming or not, and that all any man can do is meet it with whatever grace he can summon. The sun rises and sets. Days pass. The world continues, indifferent to individual extinction. But in the high desert of Wyoming, where the wind still carries the scent of sagebrush and distant storms that never arrive, there are those who swear they can sometimes see a figure standing in the street at sunset. A man in a sheriff's coat and hat, watching the western sky, waiting for the moment when the light fails and darkness claims everything. He is still there, they say, still waiting, still knowing. And if you are foolish enough to be in Redemption Creek, when the sun touches the horizon, you might hear a voice like wind through canyons, like water over stones, like the creak of rope under weight. And it might speak to you the way it spoke to Thomas Wardell on that September morning in 1894. You will die when the sun touches the horizon. And if you hear that voice, if you feel that certainty settle into your bones, then you had better do what the sheriff did. Make your peace, dig your grave, face what is coming with open eyes, because some things cannot be avoided. Some appointments cannot be missed, and when your time comes, the only choice you have is how you meet it. The frontier takes everyone eventually. It always has. It always will. The only question is whether you go screaming into the dark or walking with dignity toward the inevitable end. Thomas Wardell chose the latter. He dug his grave. He waited for the sun. And when his moment came, he faced it the way he had faced everything else in his hard life, with courage, with acceptance, with the understanding that death is not the opposite of life, but its inevitable conclusion, and that knowing when it comes is both curse and gift. The desert remembers, the wind remembers, and somewhere in the failing light of sunset, Thomas Wardell remembers too, standing eternal vigil in a town that no longer exists, waiting for the moment that comes and comes and comes again, forever. This is the story they tell in Wyoming, in the high desert, where the wind carries voices and the light plays tricks on weary eyes. This is the tale of the sheriff who dug his own grave before the sun went down. Whether you believe it or not is your choice. But if you ever find yourself in a dying town at sunset, and you hear a voice that speaks with terrible certainty about your death, remember Thomas Wardell. Remember what he did. And dig your grave with your own hands, because at least then you will have control over one last thing in a world that offers so little control. At least then you will know where you will rest. At least then you can face the end with the dignity that comes from preparation, from acceptance, from the simple act of meeting fate halfway. Some frontiers were never meant to be crossed, but we cross them anyway. Because that is what it means to be human, to push against the boundaries, to seek knowledge even when that knowledge destroys us, to face the dark with nothing but our courage and our mortality, and the thin hope that there is meaning in the struggle, even if the struggle always ends the same way. Thomas Wardell crossed that frontier. He looked beyond the veil and saw his death approaching. And rather than run or hide or pretend, he met it head on. He prepared, he waited, he accepted, and in that acceptance he found something that might have been peace. The sun sets, the darkness comes, the world turns, and in a grave beneath a juniper tree, in a cemetery that time has forgotten, a sheriff rests, having kept his final appointment with the only certainty any of us ever have, that we are born, that we live, that we die, and that how we face that death defines everything that came before. Remember his name, Thomas Wardell, the man who knew, the man who prepared, the man who met his fate with open eyes and steady hands. Remember him when your own moment comes, as it surely will, and maybe, just maybe, you will find in his story the courage to face your own end with a something approaching grace. The cursed frontier claims us all eventually, but we choose how we are claimed. Thomas Wardell made his choice. He dug his grave. He waited for the sun, and when the darkness took him, he was ready. That is all any of us can hope for, to be ready when our time comes, to face it without flinching, to go into the dark with our eyes open and our heads held high. The sheriff knew, and in knowing, he found freedom. May we all be so fortunate. The wind blows across the high desert, carrying stories of the dead, carrying warnings for the living. Listen to that wind. Hear what it tells you. And if you hear a voice like Thomas Wardell heard, if you feel that terrible certainty, then do what he did. Prepare, accept, face it, because the frontier takes everyone. And the only question is whether you meet it with courage or with fear. Choose courage, dig your grave, wait for the sun, and know that you are not alone, that others have walked this path before you, that Thomas Wardell walks it still, in the failing light, in the empty streets, in the space between sunset and full dark. He waits there, always waiting, always knowing, and he whispers to those who can hear, "You will die when the sun touches the horizon, but you do not have to die afraid."